Hey guys, so I'm making this video to recap some of what we covered in the Respiratory 1 lecture. I'm going to skip over the anatomy, and we're going to talk about ventilation. We're going to talk about pressure gradients and how they dictate and govern the movement of air. We're going to talk about where pressure gradients come from when it comes to human breathing, what exactly those numbers are, and how physiologists have simplified those measurements into numbers easier to work with. We're going to talk about Boyle's law and how a change in the volume of the thorax produces a change in the volume of alveoli, and how a change in the volume of alveoli produces a change in the pressure inside alveoli, also called the intraalveolar pressure. I'm going to talk to you about how the thoracic wall musculature and diaphragm can influence the volume of the thoracic cavity. We're going to discuss how during the stages of breathing, at the end of expiration, during expiration, during inspiration, the end of inspiration, the changes in the volume and pressure of the thorax and alveolus compared to atmospheric pressure. With a diagram from the book, we'll go over lung recoil, surface tension, and finally end with pleural pressure, how pleural pressure works, how it's maintained, how it contributes to ventilation, and finally, if pleural pressure is deranged by an injury, for instance, an injury to the parietal pleura, how that can impact lung function and ventilation at large. Okay, I'm going to try to go through this quicker than I did in class so that you can listen to it in the car or use it as review without it taking up much of your time. Okay, so first of all, I just want to define ventilation. When I'm talking about ventilation, I'm talking about what most people call breathing, or what some people call respiration. It's not, it's the movement of air. And I want you to remember that the movement of air is governed by pressure gradients. And just like some other areas of the body that we've talked about, a gradient exists when there is a difference in a variable, and the natural way is that things move from high to low. Air moves from areas of high pressure to low pressure. Solutes, if a membrane is permeable to them, will move from areas of high concentration to low concentration. So that's a pattern that's true here as well. And these pressure gradients, when it comes to ventilation, are set up or provided by atmospheric pressure, also called barometric pressure, and by the thoracic wall muscles and the diaphragm. So, when it comes to inspiration, actually, first let me say, atmospheric pressure is around 760 millimeters of mercury, and Okay, so we'll start there. So for inspiration, you guys will remember I drew a diagram of a guy and his lungs. And we said, because air movement is dictated by pressure gradients, air will move from areas of high pressure to low pressure. The pressure out in the atmosphere is 760. And to simplify things, physiologists have assigned a pressure of 0 to the atmosphere. Inside the alveolus, well, we'll come back. Let me just tell you. Inside the alveolus, during inspiration, when air is moving from an area of high pressure outside to low pressure inside, the pressure is 759, which is lower or negative in respect to 760. Okay. And so the way that it's been simplified is we call atmospheric pressure 0, and you can call the pressure inside the alveolus during inspiration -1, since 759 is 1 less than 760. So, because -1 is lower than 0, air moves from an area of high pressure toward lower pressure, and air is able to flow into the lungs. For expiration, pressure in the alveolus is about 761. So I think that you can also see why this can be simplified to +1, 1 more than 760. The atmospheric pressure, of course, is still 0. So in this situation, you'll notice that the pressure inside the alveoli is higher than the atmospheric pressure. And because air moves from areas of high pressure to low pressure, that allows air to be forced out of the lungs, or to move out of the lungs and expire. Okay. Next thing I want to mention is Boyle's law. You'll recall that Boyle's law states that pressure equals a constant, which in our case, a temperature constant, which in our case is body temperature, over volume. And this means that if inside a container, as pressure goes up, volume moves in the opposite direction and goes down. And if the pressure inside a container goes down, then the volume goes up. Okay? And we used this law and applied it to the lungs by saying a change in the volume of the thoracic cavity produces a change in the volume of the alveoli, and that produces a change in the pressure of the alveoli. Okay? And if we apply Boyle's law to what I just wrote, If the volume of the thorax is increased, the volume of the alveoli increase, and the pressure in the alveoli decreases. In a second, I'm going to explain why these two move in the same direction, but when it comes to volume and pressure, these move in opposite directions. Okay, and if I say it the other way, when the thoracic volume decreases, it produces a decrease in the alveolar volume, which produces an increase in the intraalveolar pressure. Okay, so why do these move together? Just remind ourselves that the thoracic wall is comprised of the rib cage. The rib cage is lined with a layer of a serous membrane called the parietal pleura. Then you have the lung. With a layer of visceral pleura. And I'm drawing this visceral pleura a little thick because the way I drew it, I want you to really see that the two pleural layers are adherent to each other. And there's a thin layer of fluid in the middle of those two serous membranes that help create negative pressure between those two layers. And just like if you dipped your hands in water and tried to gently pull them apart, you'd find that there's almost a feeling of suction that prevents that from happening, and that you're experiencing negative pressure in between those two, in between your hands. And negative pressure exists between those two layers. So what it means is they're adherent to one another. The yellow parietal pleura is densely adherent to the inside of the thorax. The green visceral pleura is densely adherent to the lung. And so these four structures are adherent to one another, so that if the thoracic wall moved out and the volume increased, then that change in volume would be transmitted to the alveoli, and they would go from small to high volume as a result. The other structure here that's important to point out is the diaphragm. The diaphragm is dome-shaped when relaxed, and when it contracts, it moves downward toward the abdominal cavity, and it flattens out, contracted. Okay. So, this is the reason that a change in volume of the thorax translates to a change in volume of the alveoli. How does this happen? Contraction of thoracic wall muscles. These are the external intercostals. These are muscles that attach and insert on the sternum, that lift the sternum up and anteriorly. External intercostals raise the rib cage laterally, all of which contributes to an increase in volume inside the thorax, and of course as well the diaphragm. Okay, so review the forces that act on the thoracic wall and the thoracic cavity to change the volume, to increase the volume. And remember that, the volume is decreased when those muscles relax. Okay, and so this is an active process. This is contraction. And when they relax, this is a passive process, because the relaxation and the decrease in the thoracic cavity volume, what's responsible for that is elastic tissue in the lung. Just like we pull out a rubber band, just like we pulled the thorax open, elastic in a rubber band stands ready to snap back into place as soon as you release it. And that's what happens here. And that's why the chest can passively recoil when contraction stops. Okay. So at this point, I want to draw that diagram that we talked about. And as you guys are watching this, I encourage you to, draw these things along with me. Sorry, I didn't already have this drawn. Let me just get them all set up. These aren't to scale, the proportions aren't perfect, right? But, you get the idea. So number one, as you remember from the book, is end of expiration. Okay, end of expiration. And the trachea comes down. And what I like to list on these when I'm doing this is, volume of the thorax, volume of the alveoli, pressure of the alveoli. And the atmospheric pressure is it's standard, it's 0. Right, that's what we call it, it's the same, at least for the purposes of this diagram. So at the end of expiration, the volume of the alveolus is low because it's been emptied. The volume of the chest is, sorry, my thing just went off. Sorry about that. The volume of the chest is low, and the volume of the alveolus is, now remember what I said about end. Equal. Expiration and inspiration stop when the pressure equalizes between the atmosphere and the intraalveolar pressure. So expiration is ended because these two are equal. Okay. Number two is called during inspiration. During inspiration, the chest wall is moving out. Oh, and here the diaphragm is relaxed. The chest wall is moving out during inspiration. The diaphragm is moving down and contracting. And those factors are increasing the volume of the thorax. They are increasing the volume of the alveolus. And they are decreasing the pressure of the alveolus. The atmospheric pressure is 0. And so what you see when you draw it is these structures are moving out, the alveolus is getting big, and the pressure inside it is negative relative to 0. And so air moves from a high pressure to a low pressure, and air flows into the lung. Okay? number 3 is end inspiration. Inspiration ends when pressure inside the alveolus equals pressure in the atmosphere. So, thoracic volume is still up. The volume of the alveolus is still up. The intraalveolar pressure is equal. And because it's equal, air movement stops, marking the end of inspiration. The diaphragm at this point is still down. The ribs are still up and out. The sternum is still anteriorly displaced, and the thoracic volume is high. At the end of inspiration, here, during expiration, the ribs and the sternum are moving in. The diaphragm is relaxing and becoming more dome-shaped. All of these things serve to lower the volume of the thorax. And because of this effect that I described earlier, it's also lowering the volume of the alveoli. And these two have the effect of increasing the pressure in the alveoli. So, during expiration, the alveolar volume starts large and becomes smaller, obviously, as these things move in. The effect it has is making the pressure positive, and because there's now a difference in pressure gradients, air will move from an area of high pressure toward low pressure, and air will rush out of the lungs. The patient is exhaling. Okay, so I want you to be able to recreate that diagram. And when you look at this right now, it looks a little messy. It's not perfect like in the book, but the point is the process that I went through and being able to explain it as I go. And that's what I want you guys to be able to do. Okay, so I'm going to stop this video here so that you can chunk these things up a little bit. But this is ventilation.